"You're old. Go live in a nursing home." That's what my daughter said after selling my house behind my back to buy a car. This is my story. The story of a man who gave everything to his family only to be abandoned by the one he loved most. Before you listen, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this. And please, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far my story reaches. Thomas had been counting down the hours to this day all week. The suffocating loneliness of retirement and the deafening silence of his modest apartment had begun to crush his spirit, each passing year weighing heavier on his shoulders. He ached for laughter, craved conversation, yearned for the beautiful chaos of family life. So, on that crisp Tuesday morning, he decided to do something extraordinary, something he hadn't dared attempt in years. He rose before dawn, dusted off his treasured recipe book, and began crafting Rachel's favorite dessert, a homemade apple pie made with trembling hands and overflowing love. He could still see her sneaking those precious bites while it cooled, her eyes sparkling with pure joy. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried every ounce of love his weathered heart could hold. As the pie transformed in the oven, that heavenly aroma swept through his tiny kitchen, unlocking a treasure chest of golden memories, holidays bursting with warmth, whispered bedtime stories, her radiant smile at her first school dance. Rachel wasn't connected to him by blood, but she had become his entire universe the moment he cradled her in his arms at that adoption center. His beloved wife, Mary, had chosen her with such breathtaking tenderness. "This one," she had whispered like a prayer, "this precious little girl needs a father like you." And from that life-changing moment, Thomas had poured his very soul into raising Rachel. He showered her with unconditional love, fought for her education, built her a fortress of stability, even when money was scarce and his body was failing him. When the pie emerged golden and perfect, Thomas wrapped it like the precious gift it was, nestled it in his worn picnic basket, and slipped into his finest sweater. He combed his silver hair, something that had become a rare ritual, and studied his reflection in the mirror. "You clean up just fine, old man," he chuckled softly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with shaking fingers. The drive across town stretched endlessly before him, giving his anxious mind time to rehearse the words dancing on his tongue. He didn't need the world, just a few stolen hours of conversation, a shared meal, maybe a laugh that would chase away the loneliness. A gentle reminder that he still mattered, that he was still her father, no matter how many years had carved lines into his face. But when he turned onto Rachel's familiar street, his heart plummeted like a stone. There, gleaming arrogantly in her driveway, sat a pristine luxury SUV, showroom fresh, with dealer plates still blazing white. It was the kind of vehicle Thomas had only glimpsed in magazines at the barbershop, a dream wrapped in steel and leather. His brow furrowed with confusion. Rachel had always walked the razor's edge financially, surviving from one paycheck to the next. He had even rescued her from eviction notices more than once this past year. How could she possibly afford such extravagance now? Had fortune finally smiled upon her? Had she discovered some hidden treasure, married into wealth? The questions multiplied like storm clouds as he parked across the street, staring at the house he had once helped her transform into a home. He climbed those familiar front steps with deliberate care, balancing the precious basket in one trembling hand. The wooden porch sang its creaky song beneath his feet, a melody that once sent Rachel into fits of giggles when she was small. A bittersweet smile tugged at his lips, remembering how she'd danced from plank to plank, determined to avoid the squeaky ones in their silly game. But that smile crumbled to dust as he pressed the doorbell. One ring, two. The chimes echoed through the house like a funeral bell, but no welcoming footsteps hurried to greet him. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally surrendered, revealing his daughter, now in her 30s, armored in flawless makeup and designer perfection. "Dad," she said, the word falling flat and lifeless from her lips, without even a flicker of surprise or joy. No embrace, no "I've missed you so much," no trace of warmth in her voice, just a cold, cutting stare that sliced through his heart. Thomas shifted like a scolded child and offered the basket with trembling hands. "I brought your favorite," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Rachel's eyes never even acknowledged his gift. She simply stepped aside like a reluctant doorman and delivered the crushing blow. "You shouldn't have come without calling." And in that devastating moment, Thomas felt something precious shatter inside his chest. Not just in her, but in the sacred bond they had built together. He just didn't know how completely his world was about to collapse. Not yet. The dinner at Rachel's house carried the weight of unspoken dread from the very first moment. Though the table gleamed with polished silverware and flickering candlelight, an arctic chill seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. Rachel's fingers danced across her phone screen with deliberate indifference, each swipe a silent rejection of her father's presence. Thomas fought desperately against the suffocating silence, weaving tales from his week, like a drowning man grasping for lifelines. But her responses cut through his efforts like shards of glass, sharp, brief, and devastatingly dismissive. Perhaps exhaustion had claimed her, he reasoned with himself. Perhaps some invisible burden weighed upon her shoulders. Yet still, his heart clung to the fragile hope that this evening might resurrect the bond they once shared. The ache of missing her had become his constant companion. As they transitioned to dessert, thin slices of the apple pie he'd lovingly prepared with his own trembling hands, Thomas summoned a gentle smile that masked his growing desperation. "That's a magnificent car gracing your driveway, Rach. Must have commanded quite a fortune." Her gaze remained imprisoned by her plate, as if eye contact might shatter some carefully constructed facade. "Yeah. Caught a break on the price," she muttered, her disinterest hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. Thomas, his patience infinite and his love unwavering, ventured once more into the minefield of conversation. "I pray it didn't drain your savings, sweetheart. You've always possessed such wisdom with finances." Rachel's shoulders rose in a dismissive shrug as wine disappeared down her throat. "I survived, Dad." The very air seemed to thicken with malevolent secrets. Something sinister lurked beneath the surface, something that made Rachel's avoidance feel calculated, predatory. The growing chasm of tension drove Thomas to seek refuge in his phone, hoping to find solace in a neighbor's innocent message. But as his thumb unlocked the screen, fate delivered its crushing blow. Property transfer completed. Time ceased to exist as his eyes devoured those three devastating words. His trembling finger tapped the notification, and his world collapsed in real time. There, in cold, merciless legal language, lay the death certificate of his dreams. His house, the sanctuary where love had built a lifetime, had been torn from his very soul, sold, stolen, transferred from his name to hers like a piece of meat traded at market. His voice emerged as barely a whisper, fractured and bleeding. "Rachel, what have you done to my home?" For an eternity that lasted mere seconds, she remained frozen, a statue of guilt caught in the headlights of discovery. When she finally spoke, her words fell like ice daggers into his heart. "I needed it. You're wasting it anyway." Thomas felt his reality splinter. "Wasting it? That house is my soul, Rachel. Your mother and I poured our hearts into every brick, every memory within those walls." Rachel exploded from her chair like a caged animal finally showing its claws. "You're ancient, Dad. You're drowning in a house too big for your failing body. The bills are crushing you, and you're too proud to see it. I sold it and invested the money wisely. My car, my condo. I secured my future." Her words detonated in his chest like grenades. Thomas stared at this stranger, wearing his daughter's face, his vocal cords paralyzed by the magnitude of her betrayal. The silence stretched between them like a canyon, filled with the ghosts of every bedtime story, every scraped knee he'd kissed, every proud moment they'd shared. You annihilated my entire world, without a single word." His voice shattered completely, each word bleeding from his lips. Rachel's face remained a mask of stone. No remorse flickered in her eyes. No humanity survived in her expression. "It's finished," she declared, gathering dishes with the efficiency of an executioner cleaning up after the deed. You can inhabit my couch for a few nights while the lawyers finalize your exile. But perhaps it's time you embraced reality. Assisted living awaits. Thomas sat entombed in his chair, a living corpse surveying the ruins of everything he'd believed sacred. The pie before him had turned to ash, but it paled in comparison to the wasteland that had once been his heart. Thomas's fingers trembled as he held the phone. He double-checked the notification, hoping it was a mistake, a scam, anything but what it seemed. But it wasn't. The address, the deed, the transfer, all were legitimate. He looked up, his voice low but firm. "Rachel, please tell me this isn't what it looks like." She dried her hands slowly on a towel and leaned against the counter. "I didn't think you'd find out like this," she said, completely unfazed. "But yes, I sold the house." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Thomas stared at his daughter, the little girl he had once held through thunderstorms, taught to ride a bike, stayed up with during nightmares. Now she stood there, emotionless, as if selling his entire life meant nothing. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do that?" Rachel sighed, walking back to the table, pouring herself more wine like it was just another evening. "You're old, Dad. That house is too much for you. You barely use half the rooms." He felt his heart tighten in his chest. "That was my home, your mother's home, our memory, our life." Rachel didn't blink. "And now it's someone else's. It's sold fast. The market's hot. I needed the money. You've had your time, Dad." Then, as if adding salt to a bleeding wound, she said it. "You can live in a nursing home. You don't need a big house anymore." Her tone was casual, detached, like she was talking about a stray cat, not the man who had raised her. Thomas stood up slowly, his knees weak, his breath shallow. "You didn't even ask me," he said, voice shaking. "You just took everything." Rachel's expression hardened. "I didn't want to have that fight. You just say no. I did what was best for both of us." He almost laughed, not from humor but disbelief. "Best for you, maybe. You didn't even ask me if I was okay, if I had somewhere to go." She shrugged. "I figured you'd find a place. There are nice retirement communities nearby." He looked around the house. The elegant dining set, the modern kitchen, all things bought with the money from the home he had built with love and hard work. His life, erased and repackaged as convenience for someone else. "What happened to you, Rachel?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Her cold eyes met his. "I grew up. Maybe you should too." That was the final blow, a sentence that would echo in his soul longer than she could ever imagine. As silence fell again, Thomas sat down slowly, his hands folded in his lap. He was no longer confused, no longer questioning, only hollow. His daughter had sold more than his house. She had traded his dignity, his trust, and their bond for a down payment and a car. And now, all he could do was sit in the house built on betrayal, watching the woman he once called family become a stranger. Thomas sat in stunned silence, hoping, praying, that Rachel would take it back, that she would suddenly laugh and say it was all a misunderstanding. But there was no laughter, no softening, just cold eyes and an even colder heart. "I don't understand," he murmured. "How could you do this to me?" Rachel rolled her eyes and stood up from the table. "I already explained. You're acting like a child, Dad. Stop being dramatic." He stood too, gripping the back of the chair to steady himself. "Rachel, please, at least let me stay the night. I have nowhere to go." Her expression turned sharp. "No, I don't want to deal with this. You showing up here like some lost dog, bringing your pity pie, trying to make me feel guilty." She gestured toward the door. "Take your things and leave. I've done enough." Her voice was filled with venom, like she was disgusted by the man who raised her. Thomas looked down at the apple pie, still wrapped neatly in foil, untouched. A symbol of love now turned into a burden. He picked it up with trembling hands. "I thought this would make you smile," he said softly, mostly to himself. "You used to love it." Rachel didn't reply. She simply turned her back and walked away, disappearing into the hallway as if she were done with him for good. His legs moved slowly toward the door, the weight of the betrayal making every step heavier than the last. He opened it with hesitation, pausing for one last glance at the home that once held so much promise. But there was no warmth here. No trace of the girl he once knew, just a stranger with his daughter's face and a luxury car bought with the price of his memories. "Goodbye, Rachel," he whispered. though she didn't care to hear it. Outside, the night air hit him like ice. It was cold, not just in temperature, but in meaning. He walked down the steps, pie in hand, dignity trailing behind him like a forgotten coat. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear, it was grief. Grief for a daughter who had lost her way. Grief for a home he could never go back to. Grief for being thrown out like he was nothing. Thomas stood at the curb, unsure of where to go. The streets were quiet, but his mind roared with questions. What had he done wrong? Where had he failed? How did love turn into this? But there were no answers, only a deep, echoing silence, the kind that follows a heartbreak too heavy to carry. With nowhere else to turn, he took his first steps into the night, alone. The rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops as Thomas wandered aimlessly down the sidewalk. Each droplet felt like the sky itself was mourning with him, soaking his jacket and hair, blurring the world in front of his tired eyes. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. All he knew was that he couldn't stay there in the shadow of the house that once meant everything and now meant nothing. The pie, still in his arms, had grown cold like the silence between them. His shoes squelched in the puddles, each step echoing the weight of betrayal. He remembered the day he brought Rachel home from the adoption agency, a wrinkled, wide-eyed baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. She had no one, no parents, no family. But Thomas gave her everything. He raised her as his own, with all the love a father could possibly give. He worked overtime shifts at the auto shop just to afford her school supplies. He skipped meals so she could eat better. Every Christmas, even when money was tight, he found a way to put a gift under the tree with her name on it. She had no idea how much he gave up, or maybe she did, and just didn't care. His heart ached at the thought. Had she always felt this way? Had he missed something? He had tried to be both mother and father after his wife passed, to smile when he wanted to cry, to be strong when he felt weak. Rachel used to curl up in his lap when she was little, call him her hero. Now he was just old, a burden, something to cast aside once she'd gotten what she wanted. He stumbled to a nearby bench and sat down, letting the rain soak him through. The pie slipped from his lap and landed upside down in a puddle. He didn't even flinch. His chest heaved, and then the tears came, hot, stinging tears that refused to stop. He wept, not from anger, but from heartbreak, from exhaustion, from watching everything he'd built, everything he'd loved crumble in front of him. He wasn't crying because he'd lost his house. He was crying because he'd lost her. The little girl who once held his hand and said she never wanted to lose him had thrown him away like trash. And now, for the first time in years, he felt truly, utterly alone. A couple passed him on the sidewalk, huddled under a shared umbrella. The woman glanced at him briefly, then looked away, whispering something to her partner. They didn't stop. Why would they? To them, he was just another old man on a bench, drenched and pitiful. They couldn't see the life he had lived, the sacrifices he had made, the love he had given. No one could. That was the hardest part, being invisible in a world he helped build. As the rain fell harder, Thomas looked up at the sky and whispered, "Why?" Not to Rachel, not even to God, just to the air, to the nothingness that now filled the space where family used to be. He didn't have an answer. All he had was the cold and the ache, and a heart too full of memories to forget. The night had already swallowed the sky when Thomas finally stopped walking. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, but he was soaked to the bone, his joints aching from the cold. He stood under the flickering light of an old gas station, unsure of his next move. He had no house to return to, no key that opened any door. His phone buzzed once, another automated email, a reminder of some bill he couldn't pay. He let out a breath and looked up just as a rusty pickup truck pulled into the lot. The door creaked open and out stepped a stocky man with grey hair and a flannel shirt, a familiar figure. "Tommy," the voice called out, uncertain but concerned. It was Jack, an old friend from the auto shop where Thomas had worked for decades. They hadn't seen each other in over a year. Life had pulled them in different directions after retirement, but in that moment, Jack didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He just walked over, placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder and said, "Get in the truck." Inside the truck's warmth, Thomas finally relaxed for the first time all day. Jack didn't push him to talk. They drove in silence, country music playing softly from the radio. At Jack's modest farmhouse just outside town, his wife had already made up the guest room by the time they arrived. Thomas was given dry clothes, a warm shower, and a bowl of hot stew. He ate slowly, silently, the steam from the bowl blurring his vision as he held back more tears. Jack simply sat nearby, nursing a beer and letting his friend breathe. That night, lying in the guest bed, Thomas stared at the ceiling fan spinning above him. For the first time in hours, he felt safe, not happy, not healed, but safe. And that was enough. He thought about Rachel again, about her words, about the cruelty in her eyes. But he didn't feel anger anymore, just a deep, aching sadness. He knew he could call the police, get lawyers involved, demand some kind of justice. But what would that fix? Would it undo the betrayal? Would it bring her back? He rose early the next morning, the sun not yet over the hills, and sat out on the porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the world felt quiet again. Jack eventually joined him with 2 cups of coffee, handing one over without a word. "What are you gonna do?" he asked gently. Thomas didn't answer at first. He looked down at his hands, weathered, calloused, but still steady. "I don't know," he finally whispered. "All I've got left is an old car and some clothes in a duffel bag." Jack nodded, then said something simple, but grounding. "Then you start from there." "Bo?" Those words settled into Thomas's chest like warm coal. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for a man who had just lost everything, something was better than nothing. Maybe even the start of something new. It was a quiet morning when Thomas's phone buzzed again, this time with a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring once, twice, before finally answering with a groggy, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cheerful, almost too cheerful. "Mr. Thomas Carter, this is Julia from the State Lottery Office. I'm calling to confirm you are the registered holder of ticket IJAR A39724, purchased 3 weeks ago at Fairgrove Gas on Route 9. He blinked. That dusty ticket. He had bought it absent-mindedly on a whim, back when hope still lived inside him. "Yes," he said slowly, heart starting to race. There was a pause, then, "Sir, that ticket won. $18 million. Silence. Then her voice softened, maybe expecting disbelief. "Mr. But Thomas had stopped breathing. The room tilted. The walls of Jack's guest room blurred around him. His hands trembled, phone clutched tight. 18 million, he repeated, barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. We'll need you to come to the main office with your ID and ticket. Congratulations, Mr. Carter." The call ended, but Thomas sat frozen. The phone slid slowly from his fingers. Jack found him like that, still as a statue, and Thomas could barely get the words out. Jack, I won the lottery." It took a few more minutes, but eventually, Jack laughed, slapped his back, and pulled him into a hug. But Thomas didn't laugh. He was shaking, crying, not from joy, not entirely, from the weight of it all, of everything he had just lost, and now, suddenly, gained. In the kitchen, the old torta de massin still sat in a plastic bag on the counter, untouched. 18 million couldn't change what had already happened, but it could change what came next. Over the next few days, everything moved fast. Verification, interviews, paperwork. The media wanted his story, but Thomas declined. He kept it quiet. He let Jack and his lawyer handle the logistics, choosing not to return to town yet. Rachel didn't know. Nobody knew. And Thomas liked it that way. Power, he realized, wasn't in revenge. It was in choice. And he wasn't ready to be loud. Not yet. The silence suited him. It gave him space to breathe, to think, to feel something again. Not anger, not bitterness, but peace. Each night, he sat on Jack's porch, looking out into the fields, sipping tea, and imagining what kind of life he could build now. Not one of luxury, not one of noise, but a life of meaning. He didn't want a mansion or yachts. He wanted a small place with a garden, maybe a workshop, somewhere to be useful, somewhere he could find purpose again. But one thing he was sure of, Rachel would not be part of it. That bridge had burned. Still, he wondered if she ever thought about what she did, or if she would even care. One evening, Jack leaned on the railing beside him and said, "You gonna tell her?" Thomas shook his head. "Not now. Maybe never." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Thomas nodded. "I don't need her to know I won. I just need to know I didn't lose myself." It was the first time Jack saw something different in his friend's eyes. Not pain, but resolve. Something had shifted in Thomas, and it was quiet but permanent. A silent turn, a new direction, a seed of dignity growing where betrayal had once lived. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas finally smiled. Faint, but real. The world hadn't ended. It had just changed. And maybe that was enough. A month later, Thomas had disappeared. Or at least, the man the world used to know had. With the help of Jack's friend, an experienced lawyer named Carla Whitmore, Thomas carefully crafted a new identity. Not out of fear, but freedom. He didn't want attention, he wanted peace. Carla helped him set up trusts, a new name, Henry Rhodes, and handled all legal transitions. It was surprisingly easy to vanish when no one was really looking for you. Rachel hadn't called, not even once. That fact no longer surprised him. It only confirmed what he already knew. He traveled to a neighboring state, not too far, but far enough to start over. There, tucked between golden hills and quiet roads, he found the perfect place. A farmhouse with land, charm, and history. The previous owner had passed, and the house had sat untouched for 2 years. Thomas saw potential. It reminded him of the home he lost, not in architecture, but in spirit. Within a week, the papers were signed, and Henry Rhodes was now the proud owner of a 4-acre dream. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like rebirth. But Thomas wasn't interested in just living comfortably. He wanted to do something that mattered. He spent nights walking the fields, thinking, remembering the faces of old co-workers who were laid off for being too slow, or neighbors who were forced into homes when no one would hire them anymore. The world forgot the old. Thomas hadn't. He made a decision. He would create a business, not to grow rich, but to give others like him a place to belong, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning. That's how Rhodes Restoration was born. The idea was simple: home repairs, woodworking, and custom furniture made by skilled hands. Hands that had built decades of experience, but had been dismissed by youth-obsessed industries. Thomas put out a call in the local newspaper and on community boards, hiring skilled seniors. No experience with technology required, must love working with your hands. Within a week he had 12 applicants, men and women with calluses, stories and eyes that lit up when they talked about what they used to do. Thomas hired every single one of them. They started slow, fixing up sheds, crafting chairs, patching fences, but word spread. The quality was unmatched, the service kind, the prices fair. Soon, the phone never stopped ringing. Locals were charmed not only by the craftsmanship, but by the mission. Customers brought cookies to job sites. Some just stopped by the workshop to talk. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a movement. And Thomas, or Henry, stood quietly at the center of it all, watching something beautiful grow from the ashes of betrayal. In the evenings, he sat by the fireplace with a notebook in hand, jotting names, schedules, and little quotes he overheard from his workers. They called him boss, but always with a smile. None of them knew his real name. None of them knew what brought him here, and he liked it that way. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was a builder, not of homes, but of second chances. The past was a scar, yes, but it no longer bled, and every day, with every project completed, he was quietly rewriting his story. It started with a small article in the local newspaper, "Retired Hands, Restored Homes." The journalist had interviewed one of Thomas's workers at a farmer's market, curious about the handmade wooden stools he sold. A week later, Thomas opened the paper and saw a photo of his crew smiling in front of the workshop. The piece praised the idea behind Rhodes Restoration, a business run by seniors for the community with heart at its center. Thomas sipped his coffee slowly, eyes lingering on the headline. He hadn't expected attention, he had only wanted purpose. But something had shifted. Calls came from neighboring towns. Then counties, journalists, bloggers, and even a television crew requested interviews. One morning, A letter arrived from a university ethics professor asking permission to write a case study about the company. "You've restored more than houses," the professor wrote. "You've restored dignity to aging." Thomas felt humbled and a little wary. He didn't want fame. He wanted his people to shine. So he always stayed behind the scenes, letting his crew speak for the company. Still, they talked about him fondly, the boss with the kind eyes. The workshop grew. They moved into a larger space, renovated with the help of local volunteers. They added new departments: upholstery, painting, custom cabinetry. Every older worker brought a new skill, and Thomas always made room. The youngest on staff was 60, the oldest 89. Some had memory lapses, others walked slowly, but their hands were steady, their spirits strong. Thomas gave them no deadlines, just respect, and somehow they always finished on time. Customers wrote thank you letters in cursive. Children gave hugs to the grandpas and grandmas with tool belts. One evening, the town mayor showed up unannounced with a plaque for outstanding contribution to community and compassion. The crew clapped. Thomas stood awkwardly at the back. He hadn't wanted recognition, but the look on his team's faces made it worth it. That night, one of the workers, Eleanor, a widow who hadn't smiled in years, baked a cake. They celebrated with tea and laughter. No one mentioned profit margins or business goals. They talked about the chair they had fixed for a lonely vet, the fence built for a single mother. That was their currency. In a world that often discarded people once they turned grey, Road's restoration became a quiet rebellion. Customers began requesting specific workers by name. "Can Joe build our porch? Can Marlene refinish our table?" They weren't just service providers, they were storytellers, mentors, friends. And yet, through all the praise, Thomas kept his distance from the spotlight. He signed invoices as H. Rhodes and never gave interviews. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew the truth. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about all of them, the forgotten, finally remembered. Meanwhile, in another state, Rachel never noticed. Her social media was full of brunches, selfies with her new boyfriend, and filtered snapshots of the luxury car. She had no idea that the man she discarded had become a quiet symbol of hope. Thomas saw a clip of her once by accident, a viral video of her yelling at a barista. He turned it off before it finished. He felt no hate, just distance, a closed chapter. He looked around the workshop and smiled. This was his family now. Not bound by blood, but by second chances. It started slowly, a missed payment here, an ignored bill there. Rachel brushed it off at first. She always had a way of landing on her feet, or so she thought. But the truth crept in like cold air under a locked door. Her luxury car, once proudly parked in the driveway like a trophy, was repossessed in broad daylight. She watched in disbelief as the tow truck carried it away, the neighbors staring from behind curtains. That car had cost her more than money. It had cost her blood, and now it was gone just like everything else. The man she was dating stopped returning her calls. At first, he said he was busy. Then, nothing. No texts, no explanation. She saw photos of him online with someone younger, someone fresh. Her credit cards maxed out, rent overdue. She begged the landlord for more time, but he'd already had enough of her excuses. "You wanted luxury," he muttered as he handed her the eviction notice. She packed what little she could carry into old suitcases, her heels clicking on the pavement as she left the apartment she once bragged about. Now, she had nowhere to go. She knocked on doors she hadn't touched in years. Old co-workers, distant cousins, even a friend she hadn't spoken to since college. "I just need a place for a few days," she'd say, her voice trembling. But the smiles were tight, the excuses rehearsed. "We're renovating. My aunt's staying with us. It's not a good time." Doors closed gently but firmly. One woman didn't even open the door, just yelled through it. Should have thought about that before burning bridges. Rachel stood on cold porches, clutching her bag, the silence heavier than any insult. The friends who used to flood her social media with hearts and comments were gone, ghosts. Her phone buzzed with debt collectors and nothing else. She sat in fast food bathrooms, trying to clean herself up, staring into cracked mirrors. Once she even checked into a cheap motel under a fake name just to feel invisible, but the loneliness was louder there. She'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by her own choices. Not just the greed, not just the car, but the way she had spoken to him. Her father, her only real family. "You're old, go live in a nursing home." Her own words burned. She tried to justify it for a while, told herself he had it coming, that she was owed something after all those years. But the longer she wandered, the less those excuses held weight. He had loved her, taken her in when no one else would. He'd held her when she was sick, brought her apple pie when she was sad, and she sold his home out from under him, not for survival, for status, for vanity. The realization hit her in fragments, like shards of broken glass, each memory cut deeper. She didn't just lose a house, she lost a father. Now she sat on a bench near the edge of town, watching people pass without noticing her. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair a mess. She clutched a plastic bag of belongings and stared at her phone's dim screen. No new messages, no missed calls, just a reflection she barely recognized. Rachel, the girl who once laughed at others for being weak, was now utterly alone. Not because the world had betrayed her, but because she had betrayed the one person who truly loved her. And that kind of loss doesn't fade, it haunts. Years had passed. Rachel's life had become a blur of temporary jobs, borrowed couches, and the quiet shame of someone who once had everything and lost it all. One evening, in the waiting room of a shelter, she absent-mindedly watched a local news segment on the small television mounted in the corner. The anchor smiled as she spoke. "Inspiring story tonight. A millionaire businessman who rose from nothing is giving back to the elderly community." Rachel wasn't paying much attention until a photo flashed on screen. Her heart stopped. There he was, Thomas, older, grayer, but him, alive, successful, radiant. She sat upright, leaning closer, unable to believe it. His name had been changed in the article, but his face was unmistakable. The wrinkles, the soft eyes, the way he smiled just slightly to the side. It was him. The man she had thrown out like trash was now a respected philanthropist. The newscaster called him a hero of forgotten souls. Rachel's hands trembled. She hadn't seen that look on his face in years. Peace, purpose, maybe even joy. And she had no part in it. The realization hit her like a wave. While she had been surviving, he had been rising. She left the shelter that night with a new fire in her chest. Not out of jealousy, not out of greed, but regret. A deep, aching need to say something, anything, to look into his eyes and say the words she should have spoken years ago. She found the name of the town where the foundation was based. It took her days to gather enough for a bus ticket. She arrived with nothing but a small backpack and a heart full of guilt. The town was quiet, beautiful, filled with parks and modest homes. It felt like a place where healing could happen. She asked around, trying to find the office of the foundation. People spoke of Mr. Wallace with reverence. They said he was private, humble, not one for the spotlight. When she finally arrived at the gates of the community center he had built, her feet froze. It was real, there, carved into the stone, for those who were left behind. Her throat tightened. She stood outside for hours, unsure of what to do. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he hated her? What if the damage she caused was too deep to mend? But still, she stayed. Eventually, one of the staff approached. A kind woman with silver hair asked if she needed help. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I'm here to see Thomas," she whispered. He's my father." The woman studied her face for a moment, and then, to Rachel's surprise, simply said, "Wait here." Minutes passed, like hours. Her palms were sweating. Her knees felt weak. And then from the far end of the hallway a familiar figure appeared. He walked slower than she remembered, with a slight limp, but he was there. Thomas, her father. Her mistake, her hope. Their eyes met. Thomas stopped, his expression unreadable, a mix of shock, memory, pain. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed apologies in the mirror, cried herself to sleep, thinking of what she'd say. But now, face to face, she was just a daughter staring at the man she broke. "Dad," she finally breathed. "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked. Thomas didn't move, not yet. But something in his eyes softened, just a flicker, a spark, enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible. Rachel was led into a quiet office, simple but elegant. The shelves were lined with books and framed photos of smiling elderly men and women, lives Thomas had touched. A large window bathed the room in warm light, and behind the desk sat the man she once called Dad. Thomas looked at her with calm, unreadable eyes. Not anger, not relief, just distance. He gestured for her to sit. Rachel, trembling, remained standing. Her voice shook as she began, "I don't know where to begin." He didn't respond. Silence filled the room like a heavy fog. The weight of the years crashed down on her. She dropped to her knees, the tears pouring freely now. "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I was young and stupid and selfish." Her voice cracked under the weight of guilt. "You gave me everything, and I threw it away. I threw you away." Her hands clutched the hem of her own worn coat. "I was chasing things that never mattered, and when I lost everything, it was too late." Thomas sat perfectly still, his eyes focused on a distant point beyond her, as if unsure whether to look at the past or the present. "I thought of you every night," she whispered. "The silence haunted me. I kept waiting for a chance to make it right. I watched you walk away, and I hated myself for it. You didn't deserve what I did to you." Her shoulders shook. "I told myself I'd apologize if I ever saw you again. I didn't know you'd survive without me. I thought you'd disappear, but you became something beautiful, and I don't deserve to even be here." Her tears hit the floor, darkening the carpet. "But I had to try." Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "Do you know what hurt most?" he asked. Rachel looked up, her eyes swollen. "It wasn't losing the house. It wasn't sleeping in my car. It wasn't the rain that night." He paused. "It was realizing that the person I loved more than anyone else didn't see any value in me once I stopped being useful." Rachel flinched. His words were gentle, but they struck like thunder. "That kind of wound doesn't heal with just words," he added. "It lives in the silence, in the things you can't undo." She nodded slowly. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say it. I needed you to know I'm sorry, and that I'll carry it with me forever." She looked around the room. "I see what you built, and I'm proud of you, even if I'm not part of it." Thomas sighed and stood up. For a moment, Rachel tensed, expecting judgment, rejection, or worse. But instead, he walked to the window and looked outside, thoughtful. "Do you know what I see now when I look at you?" he asked softly. Rachel shook her head. "I see someone who finally understands pain," he said. "And maybe that's the first step to becoming someone better." He turned to her. "But forgiveness isn't something I can give in one moment. It's something we'd have to rebuild, slowly, if it's even possible." Rachel nodded again, wiping her face. "I'll take that," she whispered. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give." Thomas looked at her, his expression still heavy, but no longer cold. And for the first time in years, Rachel saw a trace of warmth behind his eyes. Thomas stood still for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. Then slowly, he walked around the desk. Rachel remained kneeling, unsure of what to expect. Gently, he reached out and helped her to her feet. His hands were warm, steady, the same hands that once held hers through nightmares and taught her how to ride a bike. For a fleeting second, she thought this was the moment of reconciliation. But then, he stepped back, a single step that felt like a chasm. "You taught me one of the hardest lessons of my life," he said, voice low and firm. "And for that, I thank you." Rachel looked at him, eyes wide, confused. His face was calm, but resolute. "You showed me how fragile trust is, how deeply betrayal cuts, how love, no matter how strong, can be twisted into something cruel when pride takes over." He paused, taking a breath. "And I had to break into 1,000 pieces to rebuild myself. Without you." Rachel's lip quivered. She tried to speak, but no words came. She reached forward, one hand trembling in the air. Thomas recoiled slightly, not with hatred, but with finality. "You don't get to reach for me now," he said. Not after selling the roof over my head and telling me I was disposable. I may have forgiven you in my heart, but that doesn't mean I want you back in my life." Silence fell again between them. Outside, birds chirped. Life continued. Rachel stood ashamed, trying to hold back the sobs rising in her chest. "I don't need you anymore," Thomas continued. "And you need to learn how to live with what you did. That's not punishment. That's growth." He stepped past her toward the door and opened it slowly, as if to offer her one last grace, an exit with dignity. Rachel turned toward him, tears falling freely again. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Thomas didn't look back. He spoke clearly, each word landing with quiet finality. "That's not for me to decide anymore," he said. "That's for life to decide, and for you to earn." And with that, she stepped out of the office. The door clicked shut behind her, softer than a whisper, but louder than any scream. Outside, the sky was gray. Rachel stood on the steps of the building he had built, with no help from her, no memory of her kindness, only the absence of it. She walked away slowly, each footstep echoing the emptiness she now had to carry, not because he wanted revenge, but because he chose peace. And peace, sometimes, means leaving people behind. The days turned into months, and Thomas never spoke of Rachel again. Those who knew his story only whispered it in fragments, hushed by the weight of what had been lost. Yet despite the wounds she left behind, Thomas refused to let bitterness shape his legacy. Instead, he poured his energy and wealth into something larger than revenge. Quietly, without fanfare, he began donating to nursing homes, shelters, and local community centers for the elderly. Places where forgotten people, like he had once been, still waited for someone to see them. His generosity wasn't just about writing checks. Thomas visited the homes personally. He sat with men and women whose own children had abandoned them, listening to their stories with a patience that only someone who had suffered could offer. He laughed with them, cried with them, and reminded them that they still mattered. In the eyes of those elders, he wasn't a millionaire, he was a friend, a companion, a man who understood that pain is often invisible, and that dignity is something we all deserve until our final breath. Local news picked up on his work, dubbing him the Quiet Guardian. When asked why he did it, Thomas always gave the same answer: because no one should feel like they don't belong. His story spread across the country, not the version with betrayal and millions, but the one with resilience, kindness, and second chances. Thomas became a quiet symbol of hope, the kind that doesn't shout or seek applause, the kind that plants roots in silence and changes lives one gentle moment at a time. Meanwhile, Rachel's name never passed his lips, not out of anger, but because she no longer occupied space in the future he was building. Her actions had once defined his pain. Now, his actions redefined his purpose. When people asked if he had a family, he would simply smile and say, "I did. But now I have many." And he meant it, because through loss, he had discovered something richer than wealth, a community that embraced him not for what he had, but for what he gave. In time, Thomas helped launch a foundation for aging adults without support networks. The foundation built housing, offered counseling, and hosted events to reconnect people with joy in their later years. Photos of Thomas, laughing with former veterans, baking cookies with grandmothers, planting gardens with retired teachers, filled the halls. And in every room, his presence lingered like a warm fire, steady, glowing, dependable. His past never disappeared, but it no longer haunted him. It had simply become a prologue to the legacy he was now writing. And Rachel, she never returned. Whether out of shame, pride, or the simple knowledge that she no longer had a place in his world, no one knew. Her name faded into the background of Thomas's story, like a footnote in a great novel. And he was okay with that, because justice had come, not with vengeance or confrontation, but through compassion, quiet and enduring. It wasn't loud, it wasn't bitter. It was, as Thomas always believed it should be, silent justice. One quiet evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows of his study, Thomas sat alone, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. A worn leather notebook rested on his desk. the kind he used for writing thoughts he never intended to share. He opened to a fresh page, and after a long pause, began to write. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from emotion long buried. "Dear Rachel," he wrote, the ink bleeding softly into the paper, "I still love you. You are and always will be my daughter." The words flowed slowly, carefully. He didn't write with anger or resentment, only truth. He spoke of the day she came into his life, a tiny bundle wrapped in uncertainty but full of promise. He remembered rocking her to sleep, her first words, her teenage defiance, and the pride he felt when she graduated. "I gave everything I had to see you shine," he wrote, "and maybe I failed in ways I never understood." There were no accusations, only sorrow and an ache that still lived in the quiet corners of his heart. Then he wrote of the day she sold his home, the moment her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're old. Go live in a nursing home." He described the pain not of losing his house, but of losing her, of feeling like a stranger in the life he had built for her. "That day didn't break me," he wrote, "but it changed me forever." He paused, staring at the words, then added one final line, "And even after all of it, I still hope you find peace." Thomas folded the letter gently, sealing it in an envelope without an address. He placed it in a small wooden box on a shelf behind his desk, a box filled with old photographs, tiny drawings Rachel had made as a child, and a locket that once belonged to his late wife. These were pieces of his past, fragments of love and loss intertwined. The letter joined them, not as a message to be sent, but as a truth to be remembered, unspoken but not forgotten. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would reach for that box and hold it in his hands. He never opened it. He didn't need to. Just knowing it was there, that the memories still lived even if the relationships had died, brought him a strange kind of peace. Forgiveness, he had learned, was not always about reconciliation. Sometimes it was simply about letting go of the weight we carry and choosing to move forward with love, even if it remains unreturned. The letter remained where he left it, gathering dust over the years. No one else ever saw it. It became part of the silent story Thomas carried with him, a story of pain, of grace, and of a love that refused to die, even when it no longer had a place to go. And in that quiet, unmailed envelope, Thomas found his closure. Not with a response, not with an apology, but with the simple power of words never spoken aloud. Years passed, and Thomas aged gracefully in the quiet town he had grown to love. The lines on his face deepened, not with bitterness, but with the calm acceptance of a life hard lived and hard won. He spent his final years surrounded by laughter, the kind shared among people who had seen hardship and still chose kindness. To the world, he was the founder of a company that gave dignity back to forgotten souls. To those who knew him closely, he was more, a man whose heart had broken and rebuilt itself without noise or vengeance. He never remarried. He never spoke of Rachel again. But every Sunday, he visited the local nursing homes and brought apple pies, the same kind he once carried to his daughter's door. He'd sit with the residents, listen to their stories, and share a few of his own, though never the whole truth. "Some things," he'd say with a soft smile, "are better written than spoken." And those who knew him respected that quiet boundary. They saw in his eyes the glint of a story untold, and they loved him all the more for it. When he passed away, the town held a memorial unlike any other. Hundreds came. Elderly workers, their grandchildren, volunteers, nurses, neighbors. People who had been touched by his kindness, who had found shelter, jobs, and friendship through his vision. They didn't mourn a millionaire. They mourned a man who gave people like them hope. At the funeral, no family showed up, but no one noticed. The pews were full of people who had once been strangers and became family. In his will, Thomas left everything, the businesses, the estate, the remaining millions, to non-profit organizations dedicated to elderly care, housing, and support. He named no individuals, made no exceptions, and at the very end of the document, in his own handwriting, was a single sentence. It read, "I was rejected by the one I raised with love, but embraced by those who never knew me." It wasn't written with spite. It was a truth, one that didn't seek sympathy, only understanding. The letter to Rachel was found by his lawyer, still sealed. By his wishes, it was never sent. The lawyer placed it back into the wooden box, and it was stored alongside his other personal effects, now preserved in a foundation museum that honored his legacy. Visitors still come and read about Thomas, about the man who lost everything he loved and yet gave everything he had to love others. They walk away with tearful eyes and hopeful hearts, inspired to be better to their aging parents, grandparents, neighbors. In the end, Thomas became more than a man. He became a message, one of forgiveness, of dignity, and of quiet strength. His story lived on not in riches, but in meals shared at retirement homes, in the hands held during lonely nights, and in the knowledge that every life, no matter how discarded, still holds value, and that sometimes the greatest families are the ones we find after being broken by the ones we thought we belonged to.